On a gray Tuesday morning, Thomas Carter sat at his rough-hewn kitchen table, counting the last of his coins. Just $17 stood between him and total ruin. The air was cold. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to dying embers, and his daughter, Clara, watched silently from the window, her meager breakfast of dry toast left untouched. Their old hound, Rusty, sniffed at the crack beneath the door, where a yellowed envelope had been slipped through some time before dawn. It wasn't the kind of mail they usually got. It was thick, heavy, the kind of envelope that carried weight far heavier than its paper. The name scrolled on the front in an elegant looping script meant nothing to Thomas. Malachi Brooks, a stranger. Yet when he broke the seal, his calloused hand stilled. Inside wasn't a bill or another warning from the bank. It was a letter, written in a shaky but determined hand, and a legal deed. The letter was short, blunt. You inherit my ranch and everything on it. Look for what I could not take with me. The answer waits where the old oak stands alone. Thomas blinked, rereading the words. It had to be a mistake. A cruel joke. Why would a man he'd never met, never even heard of, choose him? Clara leaned over his shoulder, her young voice trembling with a desperate hope he hadn't heard in years. Papa, why would someone leave you land? A small note from a lawyer explained only that Malachi had been a hermit, living alone for 30 years, dying without any known family. And yet, this solitary man had known Thomas's full name, his exact rural address. It was as if he had been watching them from afar, waiting for the right moment to reach out from beyond the grave. What could possibly be waiting for them beneath a lone oak tree? 2 days later, after a long, weary journey that cost them nearly half of their remaining $17, Thomas and Clara stood before their inheritance. The hope that had flickered to life in their cold kitchen died just as quickly. This was not the promise of salvation. The ranch house leaned sideways, as if a strong wind had tried to push it over and nearly succeeded. Its boards were rotted, its windows gaping like the hollow eyes of a skull. The barn beside it had half collapsed, its roof sagging toward the dirt in a gesture of final defeat. For a man already drowning in debt, this gift felt less like a blessing and more like a tombstone. Clara, refusing to be discouraged, walked the perimeter of the decaying porch. Her boot struck something hard, something that wasn't stone. She knelt, digging at the soil with her bare hands. Half buried in the dirt was a rusted metal box. Thomas pried it open with the tip of his pocket-knife. Inside lay a strange collection of items. A hand-drawn map of the property, its lines etched with cryptic symbols he didn't recognize. A heavy, ornate key, blackened with tarnish. And most startling of all, a photograph. It was a picture of a man who looked exactly like Thomas. The same jawline, the same steady eyes. But the date scrolled in white ink beneath it was from 40 years earlier, a full decade before Thomas had even been born. Rusty's sharp, sudden barking broke the stunned silence. The hound was pulling them toward the tree line where the land dipped into shadow. There, just as the letter promised, stood an ancient oak, its massive branches reaching for the sky like gnarled arms. Its bark bore the same strange symbols from the map, carved deep and weathered with age. Just below them, almost hidden by moss unless you were looking for them, were a set of initials, MB and EC. Clara touched them gently, her fingertips tracing the letters. Papa. EC. Could that be Eleanor Carter? Thomas's throat tightened until he could barely breathe. Eleanor, his mother. She had died when he was just a boy, but in his final memories of her, she had whispered strange tales, stories of secrets and buried truths, of a life she'd left behind. He had dismissed them as bedtime stories, fantasies to comfort a grieving child. Now those stories echoed back to him with chilling clarity. Malachi Brooks, her brother, an uncle he never knew he had. It seemed he had tied her name, her memory, to this forgotten place, leaving a trail of clues that stretched across decades. This ranch wasn't a random inheritance of broken timber and dead soil. It was a message, a test carefully laid for the day Thomas would finally come. The land itself might be poor, but beneath its surface a family secret waited. Something Eleanor and Malachi had hidden long ago, something meant only for Thomas to uncover. Thomas turned the heavy key over in his hand. The metal was cold and dense against his calloused palm. This wasn't the kind of key a man used for a door or a simple padlock. It was too ornate, too weighty, too... Its long shaft was etched with fine marks that caught the fading light. At first glance, they looked like scratches from decades of wear and tear. But when he tilted the key just right, Clara gasped. "Papa, those aren't scratches. They're numbers. Coordinates, maybe." Thomas frowned, running a rough thumb along the tiny grooves. The more he studied it, the less sense it made. This wasn't an ordinary rancher's key. It belonged to something much larger, something deliberately hidden. Clara's eyes were alive with a curiosity that had long been stamped out by poverty. What if there's a vault somewhere, or a safe? But Thomas's thoughts drifted to a darker place. Back home, the unpaid bank notices were piling up, a mountain of paper threatening to bury them. He had borrowed against every last thing he owned, just to keep their failing farm afloat for one more season. If this broken-down ranch was supposed to be their salvation, it was doing a poor job of it. At least, not yet. Still, Clara's determination was a force of nature. She refused to accept defeat. She searched the ruined house with a tenacity born of desperation, her small fingers tracing every wallboard, pressing against seams and tapping for the telltale echo of a hollow space. She knelt on the warped floor, tugging at loose planks. Thomas watched her with a painful mix of pride and worry. He wished she didn't have to carry the weight of his failures, the constant burden of their poverty. Yet here she was, his own daughter, scouring a dead man's ruins for answers, while he stood paralyzed by the fear of foreclosure. Then her voice rang out, sharp and clear. "Papa, over here!" She had found it, a single floorboard near the bedroom window that shifted under her touch. With a grunt of effort, Clara pried it up, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Tucked inside, wrapped in oilcloth that was brittle with age, was a small, leather-bound journal. Thomas's breath caught in his chest. The name embossed on the first page was unmistakable. Malachi Brooks. The pages trembled in his hands as he opened it. The ink was dark and clear, though the paper had yellowed to the color of old bone. Entry after entry spilled out the secret life of a man Thomas had never met, yet was bound to by blood. One line from a page dated 30 years ago made him freeze. "Eleanor came by today." Thomas's eyes blurred. Eleanor, his mother. "She's worried about the boy," Malachi had written. "Says he's got the same stubborn streak as our father." His mother had been gone for decades, a faded photograph on his mantelpiece. And yet here she was, alive on the page, worrying for him, confiding in a brother she'd never once spoken of to her own son. Page after page carried Eleanor's name alongside cryptic references to something Malachi called the collection. Clara leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the page quickly. "Papa, look at this entry." The words practically leapt from the page. "Sold another piece to the collector in Denver today. The 1933 Double Eagle brought in $2 million alone. Eleanor thinks I'm crazy for not spending it, but this isn't about the money. It's about preserving our history." Thomas's grip tightened on the worn leather binding. $2 million. For a single coin. Clara's lips parted in shock. "Does that mean—" She flipped ahead, her finger landing on another page. "Papa," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He says here, the collection is worth over $100 million. The small, dusty room seemed to tilt on its axis. 100 million. The number was so vast it felt like a fantasy. Thomas had lived his entire life scratching at dry soil for a few dollars a bushel, begging bankers for another month's patience. And here, hidden beneath the rotten floorboards of a forgotten shack, was proof that a fortune greater than he could possibly imagine might be buried right beneath his feet. But the journal wasn't a simple treasure map. Not exactly. It was the diary of a man obsessed, a man who had spent decades gathering priceless coins, hiding them, and leaving behind a trail of cryptic notes. The collection is worthless, one entry said, if the wrong people get their hands on it. Malachi had understood the danger of that kind of wealth. He hadn't hidden the fortune to spend it himself. He had hidden it to preserve it, to keep it safe until the right heir, one who understood its true purpose, could finally claim it. Thomas's hands shook as he turned to the final entries. The ink here was shakier, the lines uneven, as though written by a man whose time was running out. Yet the words cut through him like a knife. Eleanor's boy is struggling now. Lost his wife, fighting to keep his land. The time might be coming sooner than we planned. If something happens to me, he'll need the map, and he'll need the key. He'll need to understand what our family has been guarding all these years. The room fell into a heavy silence. Clara looked up at her father, the journal still open between them. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. Papa, he knew. Uncle Malachi knew exactly what you were going through. He left all of this for you, for us. Thomas closed the journal, his gaze fixed on the oilcloth that had preserved it for so long. His chest felt heavy, filled with a profound grief for the uncle he never met, and a staggering gratitude that bordered on disbelief. He had arrived at this desolate ranch expecting nothing more than a broken-down shack and the ghosts of strangers. Instead, he'd uncovered a legacy, a map, a key, and the earth-shattering possibility that salvation had been waiting for him all along, hidden just beneath a few rotten floorboards. The question that remained was simple, yet utterly terrifying. Could they decipher the clues before someone else discovered what Malachi had guarded so fiercely for all those years? The knock on the door came sharp and commanding. It wasn't the uncertain rap of a curious neighbor. It was the kind of knock that carried authority, the kind that expected to be answered. Thomas opened the door to find a man who seemed as out of place on a broken-down ranch as a diamond on a beggar's hand. The visitor wore a perfectly tailored suit, boots polished to a mirror shine, and the kind of smile that had been practiced in front of mirrors until it was flawless. He extended a manicured hand, which Thomas pointedly refused to shake. "Mr. Carter, I presume," the stranger said smoothly. "Richard Thornton, Consolidated Land Development." Thomas narrowed his eyes. They had only arrived hours ago. "How do you know who I am?" Thornton didn't even blink. "We've been monitoring this parcel of land since Mr. Brooks passed away 2 months ago. Motion sensors, long-range cameras. You'd be surprised what modern companies can manage, even in the middle of nowhere." He stepped inside, uninvited, his gaze sweeping over the cracked beams and sagging floorboards with unconcealed disdain. "This land is worthless," he declared, his voice dripping with condescension. "No water rights, poor soil. Too remote for any practical farming. Frankly, it's a burden. But my company specializes in transforming such burdens into opportunities." Then came the bait. "I am prepared to offer you $50,000, cash, for the entire property. But the offer is good for 24 hours only." Clara's eyes widened. $50,000. It was more money than she or her father had ever seen in their entire lives. It could erase their debts, keep their home farm from foreclosure, maybe even buy her a future that didn't involve scraping a living from the dry soil. But as Thomas studied Thornton's face, a deep unease coiled in his gut. The stranger's eyes weren't on the worthless shack. They lingered for just a second too long on the old leather journal Clara was clutching to her chest. His expression flickered, not with greed, but with something else. Recognition. He knew. He somehow already knew. Thomas folded his arms across his chest. "That's a generous offer," he said slowly, his voice flat. "Maybe too generous for land you just called worthless." For the first time, Thornton's polished smile faltered. He recovered quickly, slipping back into his rehearsed, charming persona. "I'm a businessman, Mr. Carter. I see potential where others only see problems, but understand me very well. The clock is ticking." As he turned and walked back to his gleaming truck, Clara whispered urgently, her eyes wide with fear. "Papa, did you see how he looked at the journal?" "He knew about it," Thomas nodded grimly. Thornton hadn't just appeared by chance. Someone had been watching them from the moment they set foot on this land. They had been waiting for the inheritance to be claimed, and now they were ready to take it away. The next afternoon, with Thornton's 24-hour deadline looming over them, Thomas and Clara returned to the old oak with shovels in hand. Malachi's journal was open to the marked entry, the instructions simple yet precise. 30 paces north from the initials, 20 paces west, then 6 feet straight down. Clara counted each step aloud, her breath visible in the cold air, while Rusty circled them anxiously, as if the old hound could sense the history buried just beneath the surface. Thomas drove the shovel into the earth. The ground was stubborn, baked hard by years of relentless drought. But each strike of the steel blade rang with a new determination. Sweat gathered on his brow despite the chill. Clara watched intently, clutching the heavy, ornate key, its strange engravings catching the low slant of the late afternoon sun. Then he heard it. A dull, metallic clank reverberated up from beneath the soil. Thomas froze, then struck again, harder this time. The sound was clearer. Metal, not stone. Together they scraped the packed dirt away until the curved, dark edge of something immense appeared. What emerged from the ground was no simple treasure chest. It was a box the size of a coffin, its surface blackened with age, its seams lined with thick rust. Clara knelt, brushing the soil from the top. "Papa, it's enormous." On one side, near the corner, a heavy lock plate glinted, faintly worn but perfectly intact. Thomas braced himself and tried to lift the container, but it refused to budge. It was as though it were anchored into the very bedrock of the earth. He set his jaw. This was not meant to be carried away. It was meant to be opened right here on this ground. He glanced at the key in Clara's hand, feeling its weight like destiny pressing against his palm. Whatever Malachi had hidden down here was no mere trinket. It was a vault. The metallic scrape of Thomas's shovel still echoed in his ears when a pair of headlights flickered across the tree line. Dust swirled as 3 heavy trucks roared up the narrow ranch road, their engines growling like predators closing in for the kill. Thomas instinctively pulled Clara close, shielding her behind the massive trunk of the oak. Rusty barked furiously as the first vehicle braked hard, and armed men spilled out. They held their rifles slung casually, but the menace was unmistakable. Richard Thornton climbed down from the lead truck, his fine wool coat catching the harsh glare of the torchlight, his polished boots absurdly clean for a man standing in the dirt. The practiced smile he wore earlier was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper. "Mr. Carter," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still night air. "I warned you my offer wouldn't last." He spread his arms wide, motioning toward the armed circle that was now closing in around them. "It's now 30,000. Cash, right here. Take it and walk away with your daughter, alive and free." Thomas's fists clenched at his sides, though he forced himself to remain still. He could see the hunger in Thornton's eyes, and it wasn't for the land. It was for what lay half buried at their feet. Clara, clutching the heavy key, felt her pulse race. $30,000 was still a fortune. Yet Thornton's desperate urgency made it sound like pennies. Thornton stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Thomas and Clara could hear him. "I'll be plain. This property is worthless as farmland, but your uncle wasn't guarding dirt. He spent 40 years collecting coins. The rarest, most valuable pieces in American history. Gold double eagles, Mercury dimes, pristine Morgan dollars. If authenticated and sold properly, the collection is worth nearly $100 million. Clara's breath caught in her throat. $100 million? The number was so vast it barely made sense. Thomas's mind reeled, trying to reconcile the broken-down ranch house with such unfathomable wealth. Thornton studied their reactions carefully, as if savoring the shockwave his words had caused. "But here's the catch," he continued smoothly, pacing in front of the half-dug vault. "Coins that rare require provenance, authentication, legal documents tying them to a rightful heir. Without you, Mr. Carter, I could only move them on the black market for a fraction of their value. But with your signature, with your cooperation, we can unlock their full worth." He spread his hands in a gesture of mock generosity. 60% for me and my organization, 40% for you. Think of it. More money than you could ever earn in 10 lifetimes of farming. Thomas's jaw tightened. "And if I refuse?" Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. He gestured lightly, and the rifles of his men angled just enough to remind them exactly what refusal would cost. "Then you and your daughter vanish into the dust, and no one ever knows what you lost, or what I gained." Clara's fingers dug into her father's sleeve. It was clear now. Thornton hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to trap them in a partnership forged not by choice, but at the barrel of a gun. The vault was real, the fortune was undeniable, and suddenly their survival meant more than any treasure. The torchlight flickered against the cold steel surface of the half-buried vault. Thomas crouched low, running his calloused hands along its edges, tracing the deep grooves cut into the metal. His heart sank as he realized the truth. This wasn't just a simple chest that a single key could open. There were heavy hinges running along the far side, thick as coffin doors, and multiple lock mechanisms glinting faintly beneath the caked dirt. The ornate key Clara clutched, though weighty and unique, would only turn in one of them. Thomas rose slowly, his jaw set like stone. "This isn't enough," he murmured, loud enough for Thornton to hear. Thornton's confident expression faltered for the first time. "What do you mean, not enough?" Thomas pointed to the ridges in the vault's face. "Look closer. One lock here, another there. I see 3, maybe 4 in all. Your key won't get you through without the others." Thornton cursed under his breath, then snapped his fingers. 2 of his men hauled Thomas and Clara upright, pressing them forward with the cold barrels of their rifles. "Then we'll find the rest," he growled, his voice tight with fury. "Your uncle left instructions somewhere, and I intend to have them." They were marched back to the sagging ranch house, their boots crunching across the frosted ground. Inside, Thornton barked orders for the journal to be read. Every line, every word, until the secret of the other keys was spilled. Clara sat by the dim lamplight, the cracked leather cover of the journal heavy in her lap. Thomas stood behind her, his shoulders squared, refusing to show the fear that was curling in his gut. Thornton hovered close, his eyes gleaming like a hawk circling its prey. "Read," he demanded. Clara opened to the brittle pages, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. Entry after entry chronicled Malachi's lonely years, his obsessive trading trips, his paranoid protection of the collection. At first there were no numbers, no clues, only rambling thoughts about coin shows and estate auctions. Thornton tapped his foot impatiently, but Thomas's sharp eyes scanned the text over Clara's shoulder, hunting for a pattern, a hidden meaning. Then Clara's voice caught. Papa, listen to this. She read aloud. Eleanor always said the important dates make the best passwords. Birth, death, marriage, heartbreak. The numbers that matter most are the ones we can never forget. Thomas felt his chest tighten. His mother's birthday, March 15th, 1952. His own birthday, August 23rd, 1978. His wedding anniversary, the day he married Clara's mother, June 12th, 2003. Numbers that were carved into his memory as deep as scars. Could these be the codes Malachi intended? Thornton leaned closer, his impatience sharpening into suspicion. So, which is it? Which one opens the vault? Thomas met his gaze, his own eyes steady and unyielding. You don't rush a dead man's puzzles. My uncle built this to keep out thieves like you. You try to force it, you'll probably lose everything. Thornton's lip curled, but before he could argue, Clara quickly turned the page, continuing to read. Another entry surfaced, written in Malachi's uneven, late-life scroll. I've hidden the sequence where only family would think to look, where Eleanor used to leave messages for me when we were children, where the old game began. Clara looked up sharply, her eyes meeting her father's. The oak tree, she whispered. The carvings. Thornton snapped to attention. Explain. Thomas's voice was gravelly. When they were kids, my mother and Malachi played games around that tree. They left each other marks in the bark, codes only they would understand. If Malachi said the sequence is hidden where the game began, then that's where we'll find it. For a heartbeat, silence pressed heavy in the room, the wind moaning through the broken shutters. Then Thornton slammed his fist against the rickety table. Fine. Back to the tree. Now. The armed men shoved Thomas and Clara ahead of them once more, lanterns swaying as they trudged back out into the dark night. Snow had begun to fall, crunching underfoot, the cold biting deep. But Clara's heart raced with a strange mix of dread and hope. She could almost hear her grandmother's laughter echoing through time, could almost see the childish scrawls her mother must have traced into the bark all those decades ago. At the tree, Thornton's men circled with their rifles ready. Clara rushed forward, ignoring their warnings, running her hands across the scarred trunk. The symbols from the map were there, the circles and marks they already knew. But lower, near the roots, her fingertips brushed against something else. Weathered numbers, carved faint but deep enough to endure. She gasped, Papa, look, the dates. Mama's birthday, your wedding day. Thomas felt his throat tighten. It was proof. The code was meant for him, meant for family. Thornton seized a torch from one of his men, his eyes glittering as he examined the carvings. 3 combinations, he muttered to himself. This is it. This is what we need. But Clara wasn't finished. She kept searching, circling to the far side of the massive oak. Almost hidden by tangled grass, she found one more carving. Not numbers this time, but words. The real treasure isn't in the ground. It's in the knowing. E.C., she whispered it aloud, tracing her grandmother's initials. The words seemed to hum in the frozen air. A warning. A truth deeper than any pile of coins. Thornton scoffed, unwilling to ponder its meaning. But Thomas understood. The vault held wealth, yes, but perhaps the greater inheritance was wisdom, and wisdom would be the only weapon strong enough to outlast the guns now aimed at their heads. The lantern beams danced across the scarred bark of the lone oak. Clara pressed close, brushing aside moss and frost, until the grooves revealed themselves. Numbers carved decades ago, weathered but perfectly legible. 3 sequences etched by her grandmother's hand. She whispered them aloud, her breath turning to white plumes in the winter air. March 15th, 1952. Mama's birthday. August 23rd, 1978. Your birthday. June 12th, 2003. Your wedding day. Her voice wavered, torn between awe and relief. These were not random digits. They were anchors of memory, keys carved in wood so that only blood could read them. Thomas stood silent, the torchlight catching the hard, grim lines of his face. These were his family's milestones, a personal truth stronger than any iron lock. Thornton leaned in eagerly, pure greed burning in his eyes. Combinations. That's what we need, he muttered, his voice thick with anticipation. But Clara was still searching, her fingers trailing lower, toward the base of the tree where thick grass and soil clung to the ancient roots. There, nearly hidden, lay another message. Not numbers this time, but words. The real treasure isn't in the ground, it's in the knowing. The letters were signed simply, E.C. Clara froze, tracing the initials with a newfound reverence. Eleanor Carter, her grandmother, the woman who had told stories Thomas once dismissed as fairy tales. Now those stories stood carved in oak, part warning, part guidance. Thornton scoffed at the phrase, too blinded by the promise of gold to see wisdom. But a spark ignited in Clara's mind. "The treasure isn't just the coins," she said softly, half to herself, half to her father. "It's how to use them, how to sell them the right way through the right hands without being robbed or branded as thieves. The knowledge is what makes them worth anything." Thomas's gaze shifted from the carved words to his daughter, a flicker of pride breaking through his weary caution. He saw it then. The inheritance was not just buried metal, but the wit and the will to protect it. And in Clara's eyes, that legacy had already taken root. Back inside the crumbling ranch house, Clara knelt on the same loose floorboards where they had first uncovered Malachi's journal. This time she pressed deeper, prying up an adjoining plank. Beneath the thick layer of dust lay another oilcloth bundle, small but heavy with promise. She unwrapped it carefully, her fingers trembling. Inside were not more coins, but a detailed map marked with 12 scattered locations across the country and a slim, leather-bound booklet. Stamped on its cover were the words, "Trusted Dealers and Auction Houses." She flipped it open. Page after page listed names, addresses, and phone numbers, each corresponding to reputable buyers Malachi had personally vetted over decades. Gold specialists in New York, silver experts in Denver, commemorative coin dealers in Chicago. It wasn't just a list, it was a network, a lifeline. Clara's voice quivered with excitement. "Papa, he didn't just hide the coins. He left us the road map for selling them legally." Thornton's expression faltered. The full realization dawned across his face, and his smile finally vanished. This wasn't a hoard of treasure that could be fenced in back rooms or melted down in secret. The true value, the $100 million, could only be unlocked if Thomas, the rightful heir, signed the inheritance papers and worked with these trusted names. Without him, the coins were little more than shiny trinkets for the black market, worth a tiny fraction of their real value. For the first time since he'd arrived, the balance of power tilted. Thomas and Clara weren't just prisoners digging under duress anymore. They were indispensable. Thornton needed them alive, cooperative, and complicit. And that leverage gave Thomas just a sliver of ground to stand on. When the first vault finally screeched open, the torchlights spilled across rows upon rows of wooden boxes stacked with gleaming gold coins. Clara gasped as the brilliant gleam of 1933 double eagles and pristine Morgan dollars filled the dark hole with their otherworldly glow. This was no myth. The Carter family legacy was real, tangible, and overwhelming in its scale. But as Thomas stared into the vault, his grip tightened on the journal. The coins were dazzling, yes, but it was the knowledge, the contacts, and the law itself that had now become their strongest weapon. For the first time, Thornton's greed felt shaky and uncertain, while Thomas held the only real key to make the treasure truly live. The vault lid groaned shut, and before Thomas could even steady his breath, Thornton was already spinning the new terms of their so-called partnership. His voice was smooth as oil again, dripping with a false generosity that made Thomas's skin crawl. "Here's how this is going to work," he said, pacing back and forth like a man rehearsing a script. "You'll use your inheritance papers and that journal to open the rest of the vaults. My men will handle the logistics, the transport, 60% for my organization, 40 for you. More than you could have dreamed of in 10 lifetimes of farming." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. "Afterward, you and your girl will disappear. New names, new lives, far away from this territory. Nobody will ever bother you again." The promise rang hollow, like a coin dropped in an empty well. Thomas caught Clara's eye across the torchlight and saw the same cold chill spread through her. Disappear. Thornton didn't mean it as a salvation. He meant it as an erasure. Clara's hand clutched the journal tighter, her knuckles turning white. When the group moved toward the second marked site on the map, Clara's sharp gaze swept over the wagons trailing behind them. Her breath caught in her throat. Among the crates of tools and lanterns were other supplies, coils of thick rope, heavy burlap sacks, and shovels meant for more than just digging up treasure chests. They weren't just prepared to extract treasure, they were prepared to bury secrets, along with anyone who got in their way. Clara leaned close to her father, her whisper urgent and terrified. "Papa, those supplies, they're not for the coins, they're for us." Thomas felt the ground tilt beneath him. Rage, cold and pure, mixed with a suffocating dread. Thornton's deal was no deal at all. It was a countdown. Their usefulness would end the exact moment the last vault was empty. His pulse thundered in his ears, but he kept his face a neutral mask, knowing that one false move, one flicker of defiance, could ignite the powder keg they were all standing on. By the time they reached the second location, near a stretch of broken-down fence line, the danger was a living thing, breathing down their necks. The iron rod struck metal with a dull, resonant clang. Another vault, this one larger, heavier, and older-looking than the first. Thornton's men let out a low cheer, their greed overriding their caution, while the torchlight caught on the barrels of their weapons. The deeper the earth gave way, the clearer the peril became. The treasure was growing, but so too was the absolute certainty that Thornton's shadowy promise of safety was nothing but a lie waiting to be cashed in. The lanterns cast long, unsteady shadows as Thornton's crew prodded the earth at the third marked location, near the foundation of the collapsed barn. At first, their digging had carried the same tense eagerness as before. But after 20 minutes of sweat and curses, the iron rod struck only bedrock. No hollow clang of a hidden vault, no buried chest of gold, just silence and stone. Frustration rippled through the men. "It's empty," one of them snarled, tossing his spade aside in disgust. Thornton bent over the map, his polished shoes sinking into the loose soil, his perfect smile finally cracking at the edges. "Check the coordinates again," he snapped. "Measure twice." But Thomas, watching the symbols on the map with careful eyes, noticed something different. The first two sites had been marked with circles, representing coins. This third one bore a different symbol, a square etched with a single clear letter. W. Clara leaned in, her breath coming in quick, shallow puffs. "Papa, this isn't a vault marker. It's something else." "W. For warning," she whispered, her voice trembling in the cold night. Thomas's gut clenched. Malachi Brooks hadn't just buried his wealth, he'd built defenses around it. If Vault 1 and Vault 2 were the treasure, then this third site was something else entirely. A signal, a tripwire. Thornton barked at his men to keep digging, but the earth gave up nothing more. Then, faint at first, came the sound. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, riding hard and fast across the frozen ground. The rhythm rolled closer, steady and powerful as thunder. Clara's eyes widened. "The warning system," she breathed. Thomas recalled a journal entry they had skimmed too quickly, one that hadn't made sense at the time. If anyone comes for the collection before the boy is ready, the warning system will tell the Guardians everything they need to know. At the time, it had sounded like the paranoid ramblings of a hermit. Now it roared into focus. Torches flickered on the distant horizon, weaving through the darkness like fireflies carried by giants. 8, maybe 10 riders, moving fast and in perfect coordination. These weren't curious neighbors or lost travelers. They moved with the silent precision of men trained to strike. Thornton's crew stiffened, their rifles sliding nervously into their hands. "Boss," one of them hissed, "we didn't plan for company." Thornton tried to recover his composure, though a sheen of sweat slicked his brow. "Nobody knows we're here," he said, his voice a little too quick, a little too loud. But Clara's whisper carried more truth than his entire speech. Uncle Malachi bought protection. He wasn't just hiding treasure, he was buying watchers. The hoofbeats swelled until the very earth itself seemed to tremble. Shouts echoed across the dark fields, authoritative and carrying the undeniable weight of the law. "This is the territorial marshal. Step away from the excavation." Thornton spun around, raw panic flashing behind his eyes. His men's bravado finally cracked under the reality of a dozen armed riders bearing down on them. Some shifted toward the wagons, looking for an escape. Others raised their weapons half-heartedly, caught between their greed and their instinct for survival. Thomas placed a steadying hand on Clara's shoulder, pulling her closer to the safety of the oak tree. The torchlight revealed more riders, spreading out in a wide arc, boxing Thornton and his mercenaries in. Malachi's genius unfolded before their very eyes. The third marker had never been meant for gold. It was a tripwire, carved into bark and memory. Dig where you shouldn't, and the Guardians would come. In the roar of hooves and the blaze of torches, Thornton's carefully woven confidence finally unraveled completely. What he thought was an easy plunder had just become a trap, sprung by a dead man decades in the making. The night split open with the thunder of hooves. From the darkness beyond the broken barn, riders poured in, their lanterns swinging, their torches flaring against the biting cold. Their formation was no ragtag posse. These men rode with discipline and precision, every rein pulled tight, every eye sharp. At their center, a tall rider carried the silver star of the territorial marshal, its glint unmistakable in the firelight. Thornton froze, his polished smile gone, replaced with a mask of pale fury. He barked at his men to stand firm, but even his voice cracked under the weight of the scene. 6 gunmen, however well armed, could not match the disciplined line of lawmen now bearing down on them. Clara clutched Thomas's arm, her knuckles white, but his stance never wavered. He knew in his bones that Malachi had laid these protections long ago, and tonight the plan was unfolding exactly as it was intended. "Territorial Marshal," a voice bellowed, carrying an authority that could not be ignored. "Drop your weapons. Step away from the excavation." For a heartbeat, a tense silence stretched across the snowy field. Thornton's mercenaries shifted uneasily, glancing at each other, then at Thornton. The man in the expensive coat tried to salvage some control, raising his voice to the approaching lawman. "This is a private matter. No crime has been committed here." But the marshal's command cut through his protest like a whip. "You're trespassing on protected property. Surrender now or face the law's judgment." The line of riders closed in, spreading to encircle the oak tree and the half-dug vault. Their rifles gleamed in the firelight, the barrels already leveled. Thornton's men hesitated, raw fear etching deep lines into their faces. Yet pride or desperation always claims one fool. One of the gunmen, his jaw tight with defiance, snapped his rifle to his shoulder, the muzzle swinging toward the encroaching riders. The night erupted. Crack, Crack, crack. The marshal's men fired in a single coordinated volley, their muzzle flashes lighting the snow like lightning strikes. The lone gunman cried out, his weapon tumbling from his grasp as he hit the dirt. Thornton ducked instinctively, pure rage twisting his features. Another of his men scrambled for cover, only to have bullets snap at the ground inches from his boots, driving him flat. The lawman's gunfire wasn't wild. It was controlled, a hammer meant to break resistance before it could truly begin. "Cease fire," the marshal roared once the message had been delivered. Silence crashed down, heavy and absolute, broken only by the groans of the wounded man. Smoke curled from the rifle barrels, drifting through the frozen air. Every single one of Thornton's mercenaries now stood with their hands raised high, their weapons dropped or kicked away. The arrogance that had fueled Thornton's offer had vanished, leaving only a man cornered by his own inevitable failure. The lawmen dismounted and moved swiftly, ropes flashing in their hands. Thornton cursed, struggling as they bound his wrists behind his back. But he was no match for the practiced efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before. "You'll regret this," he spat, but his threats rang hollow in the night air. His men, stripped of their bravado, obeyed without protest, their eyes fixed anywhere but on the glinting marshal's star. Clara exhaled a shuddering breath she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. She leaned against Thomas, her heartbeat still racing from the sharp crack of gunfire. He shifted just enough to place himself in front of her, a silent barrier against any lingering danger. Around them, the marshal's riders spread out, securing the site, checking every weapon dropped in the dirt, ensuring the vault remained untouched until it could be legally and safely examined. When the last rope had been tied and the last rifle confiscated, the marshal dismounted and strode forward. She was a tall, steady woman, her coat marked with the wear of long service. The firelight caught her badge once more as she stopped before Thomas and Clara. "You're safe now," she said firmly. "By order of the territory, this property and its rightful heirs are under our protection." Thomas nodded once, his jaw tight, but his gratitude was clear in his eyes. Clara's own eyes glistened as a wave of relief washed over her. Relief not just for their survival, but for the undeniable proof that Malachi had not abandoned them, even in death. Behind them, Thornton shouted uselessly into the night, his empty threats carried away by the cold wind. Bound and powerless, he was no longer the predator. He was the prey, caged by the very greed that had driven him to this remote patch of land. As the torches flared brighter, illuminating the fresh snow, Clara realized the storm of violence had passed. She and her father had walked to the very edge of ruin and had emerged protected, not by chance, but by the incredible foresight of a family who had planned for this very moment. The vault still waited, its secrets locked away in steel and earth. But for now, the true victory was simpler. They were alive, they were together, and they were safe beneath the shield of the law. When the gunfire had faded and Thornton's men sat bound and defeated in the dirt, the marshal approached Thomas and Clara with a calm steadiness that spoke of years in the saddle. Removing her gloves, she introduced herself. "Sarah Martinez, territorial marshal, but tonight I stand here because of your uncle, Malachi." Clara frowned in confusion. Thomas shifted uneasily. Marshal Martinez continued, her voice carrying over the crackle of the torches. 15 years ago, Malachi Brooks hired our private security outfit. He paid substantial sums in advance to ensure that if anyone ever tried to seize this land or what it hid, we would intervene. We've been monitoring this property ever since, waiting for the day his rightful heir finally arrived. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Even from the grave, Malachi had been planning, protecting. Clara whispered, almost to herself, "He knew we'd need help." Martinez opened her satchel and handed Thomas a sealed envelope. Its paper was yellowed with age but had been carefully preserved. His hands trembled as he broke the old wax seal and unfolded the letter inside. Malachi's familiar, shaky handwriting flowed across the page, steady and clear in its last testament. If you are reading this, Thomas, then trouble has found you. The collection is no longer a secret, and I am gone. But everything you need has been prepared. The collection is currently valued at $147 million, fully authenticated and appraised. A strong box at the Denver Territorial Bank contains all the records of ownership. The key to that box is sewn into the silk lining of your mother, Eleanor's, old jewelry case. Alongside the collection are letters of provenance, pre-arranged contracts with reputable buyers, and tax documents that have already been filed to protect you from seizure. You will not have to fight the government, nor will you have to deal with crooked dealers. The path is already cleared. Thomas's breath caught. He reread the lines, hardly believing what he was seeing. Malachi had not only preserved the coins, he had built an impenetrable fortress of legality around them. Papers, trusts, and buyers, all waiting. Clara leaned close, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Papa, it's all real. He thought of everything." Martinez nodded. "Within 48 hours, the inheritance will be officially transferred into your name by law. Every piece authenticated, every signature recognized. And in 6 months, if you choose, the entire collection can be liquidated for its full market value. Not black market pennies, but the full sum Malachi intended you to have." For a long moment, Thomas stood silent, the weight of generations pressing down on his chest. He had come to this ranch with just $17 to his name, expecting nothing but ruin. Now he held a letter that promised a security beyond his wildest dreams. Yet, more than the money, it was the profound love of a family who had refused to abandon him, even across time and death. Clara pressed her hand into his. "He saved us, Papa," she whispered, "even from the grave." Thomas folded the letter carefully, his resolve hardening into something new and strong. The ranch was no longer a burden. It was a legacy, and every single step had been prepared so that he and Clara would never have to walk alone again. The dust had barely settled when Marshal Martinez laid out the charges with unshakable authority. Standing over the bound and defeated figure of Richard Thornton, she spoke each word like a gavel strike. Armed robbery, criminal conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, and obstruction of a lawful inheritance proceeding. Each count fell heavier than the last, echoing across the darkened ranch yard. Thornton tried to protest, his polished confidence finally unraveling completely. "You can't prove anything. We never actually took a single coin." But Martinez's steady gaze silenced him. "You held a 16-year-old girl at gunpoint while demanding access to her legal property. That alone will see you behind bars for decades. And as for proof," she gestured to a deputy carrying a thick satchel of documents, "your entire organization has been under our surveillance for months." Inside that satchel were months of ledgers, intercepted communications, and sworn witness statements. Thornton's ring had targeted vulnerable families across the territories, coercing heirs into surrendering valuable inheritances that never belonged to them. Now the evidence was complete. The trap, long set, had finally been sprung. Thomas felt Clara's hand tighten in his. For the first time, he realized Thornton's downfall wasn't just luck. It was just as carefully prepared as the inheritance itself. As the wagon rolled away, carrying Thornton and his defeated crew into the darkness, Clara whispered, "It's over, Papa." Thomas exhaled slowly, the night air feeling lighter on his shoulders. Yes, he thought. One battle had ended, and a new life could finally begin. Marshal Sarah Martinez's final instruction lingered in Thomas's mind. Burn the old ranch house down. Start fresh somewhere else. The past has already given you everything you need. The order wasn't cruel, it was freeing. That night, as flames climbed the rotting timbers, Thomas and Clara stood side by side, watching the smoke carry away years of secrecy, loss, and hunger. The old place had been nothing but broken boards and buried dangers. Now it was only ash. For the first time, Thomas felt the past was truly behind them. 6 months later, the horizon told a different story. Where once Thomas had arrived at a ranch held together by splinters, he now looked out across 3,000 acres of fertile Colorado land. Their new home stood proud and whitewashed, with strong corrals and wide barns that echoed with life. Horses grazed in the distance, cattle dotted the green hills, and Clara's laughter carried from the corral where she practiced her riding lessons after her chores. The inheritance had been greater than he had dared to imagine. After taxes and fees, Malachi's coin collection had brought in over $151 million. But for Thomas, wealth was never about gold or numbers. It was about what he could build with it. The first thing he did was ride back to his old farmstead, place the stack of bank notices in a tin pail, and burn them. The debt that had haunted him for years vanished into smoke, no longer a chain around his family's neck. With steady hands and a clear purpose, Thomas used the inheritance to restore dignity, not just to himself, but to others. Neighbors who had lost their farms during the drought were hired on with fair wages and safe homes on the new ranch. He purchased rescue horses, livestock, and the best seed, not for vanity, but for stability, ensuring the ranch would feed more than just his own household. Slowly the land came alive again, proof that money spent with purpose could turn dust into a harvest. Clara, once a frightened girl clutching a brittle journal in a broken cabin, now carried herself with a quiet confidence. She spoke of becoming a teacher, of helping other children learn, and her eyes shone with a future full of possibility. Watching her, Thomas felt a pride that no fortune could ever measure. She was the true legacy Malachi had protected, the living proof that a family's love endures beyond graves, debts, and storms. As the sun sank low, casting long golden shadows over their new ranch, Thomas rested his hand on the smooth porch railing. The old house was gone, its ashes scattered to the wind. In its place rose a future they had built together, one rooted not in hidden treasure, but in love, endurance, and the simple wisdom to begin again. News arrived like the closing of a heavy door. Richard Thornton, once the polished face of a ruthless criminal scheme, was sentenced to 35 years in a territorial prison with no chance of early release. His network, built on intimidation and theft, had collapsed under the weight of the evidence. Law officers revealed that his men had stolen collections worth over $400 million from families all across the territories. Each recovered chest, each authenticated coin, became another piece of proof that justice had finally caught up to him. The man who thought he could buy everything with lies and muscle would now spend the rest of his prime behind iron bars. For Thomas and Clara, the verdict was more than just personal safety. It was vindication. Yet what startled them most wasn't Thornton's downfall, but what surfaced during the investigation. Documents showed that Malachi Brooks, their eccentric, secretive uncle, had been quietly funding private inquiries into Thornton's organization for years before his death. He hadn't simply buried coins in the earth. He had invested in protection and in justice, ensuring that no other family would be cornered and broken the way his own kin once had been. Clara whispered in awe. Uncle Malachi wasn't guarding treasure just for himself. He was guarding families like ours. Thomas felt the truth of her words settle deep in his chest. Malachi's real gift wasn't the $150 million they now held. It was the foresight to shield their future and the futures of countless strangers. Standing on their new porch, father and daughter finally understood that a legacy isn't measured only in gold. Sometimes it is measured in the safety one leaves behind, in the quiet assurance that love and vigilance can outlast even the grave. The evening sky over the Colorado ranch deepened into a rich violet, the first stars pricking through the horizon like promises written in light. Clara leaned against her father on the porch swing, her voice hushed but heavy with meaning. "Papa," she asked, "do you think Mom and Uncle Malachi would be proud of what we've built?" Thomas pulled her closer, his weathered hands resting over hers. His reply carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Sweetheart, they'd be amazed, not just at the land or the money, but at the woman you've become. They planned all of this so you would never have to walk through life alone." Clara's eyes shimmered in the twilight, no longer with fear or hunger, but with the calm, steady glow of belonging. As the night unfolded, the full truth of Malachi's legacy settled around them, as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. The coins, the vaults, the intricate legal protections, all of it was extraordinary. But they were only the surface of the treasure. The deeper gift was foresight. A mother's love echoed through her brother's careful planning, ensuring that her son and granddaughter would never again have to face despair with empty hands. Clara tilted her head back, watching the constellations take their places in the vast, clear sky. The thought struck her that wealth could vanish, land could burn, and even memories could fade. But preparation, loyalty, and family, those things remained indestructible. That was the inheritance Malachi had truly left behind. Thomas felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. Their new life, their restored dignity, it was all breathing in the quiet silence between them. "Now we have everything," he whispered, not as a boast, but as a benediction. In that moment they both knew the real treasure was never measured in gold or silver, but in being protected, being thought of, and being loved across generations. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of hidden secrets and justice delivered.